Thank you for coming. This is my first presentation in English, so yeah, I'm a bit nervous, but all right. So my name is Andrea. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Montreal, Canada, and today I'm going to talk about the results of my master's thesis that was about describing and understanding women's experience in Cultic groups, mostly in Quebec. Yeah. So I'm going to start with a little bit of context. As I'm going to talk about first violence against women. So as I'm sure you know, violence against women is a major issue in our society today, and women's rights have not been achieved everywhere yet and are even regressing in some contexts. So I think that's an important issue to address. I have this definition. I'm not going to read it, but it's a definition for the United Nations Assembly in 1993. I think it's a great definition to understand the concept of violence against women. And I also want to talk about, yes, violence against women, but also the difficulties faced by women's victims of violence. So being a victim of violence is obviously traumatic, but what happens to women afterwards can re-victimize them. Women are often not listened to or not believed when they testify. And victims in the Canadian criminal justice systems, victims have no place in the system and are often blamed and held responsible for their own victimization. And under Canadian law, domestic violence and coercive control are not recognized yet. So I had a slide about Cultic groups, but I don't think that's relevant here because I'm sure you're all aware. But in my dissertation, I used that definition from West and Langoni from 1986. So the main topic is women in Cultic groups, how they experience their experiences in Cultic groups. So what we can find in the literature is that the gender inequalities that women faces in society are also in Cultic groups. The group context exacerbates the gender inequalities experienced by women in society. We can also talk about patriarchal communities. Many groups maintain a patriarchal power system marked by the superiority of men, and women are forced to adopt often more traditional subordinate roles of mother and wives. We can also see violence and sexual exploitation of women in these communities. So it can be sexual relationship with the leader out of obligation, out of spiritual responsibility. It can also be seen as a privilege of being in contact with the divine figure, or it can also be an act of loyalty to the group. Violence can also be physical violence from the leader, another member of the group, or a partner, an intimate partner. Violence can also be the lack of care of, for example, women's health are not being taken care of. And there is a lot of control over the body for women. So we can note like forced or arranged marriages or reproductive coercion. And I want to say that I think one of the most important thing is that in this context, the consent is not free and informed for the women. And there is also the loss of autonomy and self-esteem that is an issue for women in Cultic groups. And this loss of autonomy and self-esteem reinforces the bond to the group and prevents freedom from the community. So I used in my research the theory of coercive control. Oh, sorry. I had a few slides about it, but I've seen a lot of people talking about coercive control during the conference. So I'm just going to go quickly on that. But I use the theory as developed by Evan Stark. so a more feminist perspective. Um, he states that women are still dominated and subjective to gender inequality and male authority that discriminates against them and places them in an inferior position to men. And this discrimination stems from historically patriarchal system. So in his book, he presents the technologies of coercive control, like he called them. It's more tactics used by men to control women in an intimate partner dynamic, intimate partner violence dynamic. So there are four main tactics. So the first one is violence. It can be physical, sexual, psychological violence, and men use the privileged information they has about the women to define their control tactics. And it's the frequency and cumulative effect of minor violence that distinguishes coercive control from other forms of violence. Then we have intimidation, so it can be constant surveillance, stalking, and also the induction of fear. Women are also isolated from society and from the outside world, and this creates a feeling of loneliness. And the fourth one is control, so it's a control of access to vital needs and also the deprivation of autonomy. So why use coercive control to understand women's experiences in Cultic groups? So first of all, in his book, Starks mentioned that history can be adapted to Cultic groups. It takes the example of Jehovah's Witnesses, and he says that women are more repressed in this context, that their external relationships are strictly controlled. And he also note the economic dependence of women. And also there are theoretical models for understanding cultic groups, such as, for example, the bounded choice or the BIDE model that highlights the same aspects as Stark. So that's why we use coercive control in this study. So about my research, so my problem was how do women experience their life before, during, and after joining a cultic group. I had a few objectives. Primarily to document and understand the experiences of women within cultic groups in Quebec. I wanted to highlight the roles of women, the power and the coercion techniques used by men to subject women to their authority, understand their experiences of victimization, and the strategies used by women to cope with their experiences. So about my method, I used qualitative methodology. So I did semi-structured interviews with former members that identified themselves as women. So it was, I had an initial question and several themes I wanted to address, but I let the women guide the interview and tell me what they wanted. I conducted 8 interviews with the help of InfoCult. They shared the recruitment poster with their contact list, and the women contact me directly. So 8 women agreed to meet with me. Their interviews were between 1 hour and 30 and 3 hours. And one, due to the pandemic, 7 were virtual, obviously, and 1 was face-to-face. And I did also thematical analysis to produce the results. A little bit of my sample. So the average age of my participants is 40. They have spent an average of 19.5 years in a cultic group. All the women we met were from Quebec, and I've lived their cultic experiences in Quebec. Also, some groups had international branches. 6 were involved in a religious group. 2 joined more spiritual and therapeutic groups. 6 were first generation, and 2 were second generation. So my results, this is the fun part. So for women's involvement in Cultic groups, I've noted that most of the women I've met committed in late adolescence, early adulthood, and sometimes after or during a conflict in their personal life. It can be the death of a relative, or someone who is sick in their family, or a crisis of identity, something like that. And I have this one participant, she said that when we go through difficult things, I think she thinks that people, leaders, can see that, and that they are able to get us in some way. And for her, it has been through friendship. And obviously, another one of my participants, Jane, she said that the leader of her community makes everyone feel special and loved. And obviously, this is an important topic to address. So the roles of women in Cultic groups, I have highlighted 2 principal roles. So the more traditional role of mother and wife. I think more than half of my participants were trapped in this role. For example, Julia, she said that in her group, it was the woman had to do everything. She had to cook, she had to take care of their husband, and she had this role of having children, a lot of children, and if she didn't do that, she was shamed. I have one other role, but it was only one of my participants. It's the deification of women. So Sarah, in her group, the women were goddesses. When we were in, she said that when we were in a group with men, women always get more attention. The leader was gentler with women. So this is just one woman, but I thought it was interesting to highlight this specific role. About the consequences of cult involvement, obviously there are a lot of issues on mental health and self-esteem. I think that at least half of my participants have attempted suicide, and a lot of depression and anxiety, and a few have been diagnosed with PTSD. And also I wanted to talk about the physical health and something that I call stress injuries. So I have many participants, well, a few participants that talk to me about health problems linked to the constant stress that we're under, like stomach problems or reproductive system problems that they have been through because they were always feeling stressed. And yeah, so I think that was really important, especially for women. So I wanted to talk about that. About the control strategies, obviously there is a lot of psychological control, emotional manipulation, guilt, suppression of intimacy, humiliation, or isolation. I want to read this quote because I think it's really, 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 really important. So Anna, in her group, the group said that all the burden of the world in society, all the pain is on my shoulder, mine as a woman, not the man next to me. It's me here, because I was told that women have lost the world, so they must win it back. So it was their ideology, but it shows how women are, um, how do you say that? They have a lot of guilt, like they put a lot of guilt on their shoulders, and it's not the men, it's really the women that have been through that sort of things. There are also relationships are also strictly controlled. obviously the people in the group were good and the people outside of the group were bad. Um, so it reinforced the attachment to the group and limited things that could make women feel supported and detached from the group. There are also economic control. So I have two women who were forced to work for the group and were not paid for that. And all the money they got, they were forced to give it to the group. So they had no money. And it was kind of forced labor because, for example, Jessica, she said that at 8 a.m. it was breakfast, and at 9 the workday starts until 2 a.m. Well, until midnight. It used to be 2 a.m. But from 9 to midnight you're working, so now you're going to tell me that you can get away during the day? No, because at midnight you must send in your schedule. You have to write down everything you did during the day, and if there is a gap between 11:30 and 11:50, they ask you, hey, what did you do? So people write down when they go to the toilet on their schedule. So women have been through that, and they were forced to work all day, and it was really traumatic for them. But I think the most important part of control for women in these groups is the body control, the control over the body. And it can be the physical appearance control. So many women I've interviewed talk to me about food control. So for example, Jessica, she told me that I had to send in my weight every Monday to the leader. I had to weigh myself and send in my weight. At one point, I was 119, and he told me, be careful, you're going to go up to 120, and you're not supposed to go over 120. But so it shows that it's really control. And she told me that it was only the women, not the men. The men could eat whatever they wanted, but the woman couldn't. And for example, there is this one woman who ate a few candies, I don't know, and she was punished for a year to read the Bible in her bedroom. And sometimes she was in the kitchen where everybody could see her, and they were like, if you eat what you're not supposed to, you're gonna be like her, to read the Bible for a year. So yeah, it's really the body control that I think it's the most important. And in some group, women were obligated to wear makeup and wear sexy clothes to please the leader and the men, and while in other, makeup was forbidden, strict dress was required, but it was always for the leader and the men. There were really, it was for them. And also sexual violence. So I think that more than half of my participants talked to me about sexual violence. So it can be sexual assault, rape, but most importantly, like I said before, the lack of free and informed consent in this context, and the abuse of power. For example, I had one woman, she was 15, and the leader of her community was, I don't know, more than 30 years old. And they had sexual relationship for a few years, and she got pregnant, and it forced her to got an abortion. And now she's seeking for help, but people are telling her that she consent at the moment, but obviously the consent in this situation was not free and informed, and there was a power relationship between the men and her. So it's really difficult to understand consent in this situation. So after that, leaving the group and learning how to live again. So leaving the group is voluntary or not. Most of the women left on their own, some because of health problem like I was talking about, that made them open their eyes on what they were living and what they were going through. And for others, it was the intervention of someone close to them. After the exit, most women faced economic and social issues, the lack of education, especially for women, the groups that had more conservative, um, that were more conservative didn't allow women to go to school, to have an education. So most of the women didn't work, or if they did, it was for the group, so they didn't earn any money, which was an issue when they left. The lack of education too, especially for those born in the group. And it's also difficult to recreate the relationships we lost because of the involvement, and to create new ones also. Obviously, the anxiety and post-traumatic stress, as I've talked about, all have anxiety and stress problems, and many have been diagnosed with PTSD. But I think the most important thing is remaining power over their life as a woman in our society. Having been deprived of their rights, freedom, and autonomy for many years, relearning how to live and regain control over their life can be a difficult step when they've been told that all their life that they shouldn't have an opinion, or that they're only fit to do the housework and look after the children. It can be really, really difficult for them to fit in our society. And looking for help can be also a challenge. All right. It can also be a challenge for women, like I said before, about the consent and yeah. So in conclusions, what I wanted to highlight is that the Cultic context is a context in which women are subjective to male authority, and we can talk about patriarchal communities. Coercive control theory seems relevant to understanding women's experience within cultic groups. So it's a context that resembles IPV context, such as described by Evan Stark. What makes it special is the group context, the fact that control comes from both the leader and the other members of the group, and also the sexual exploitation experienced by women. So the tactics described by Stark to understand the implementation of coercive control in the context of domestic violence are all found in the testimonies of the women I've met. So violence, intimidation, isolation, and control. And it helps us understand why women stay, because they are subjective to constant control and have no positive prospect for living. So I've talked obviously about the difficulties for women seeking help, and I think that something really important is the importance of developing prevention and raising awareness of the issues surrounding cultic groups. This is a subject little addressed in the literature, despite the fact that the context is conducive to the emergence of coercive control, and it's important to take it into consideration. For example, in shelters, I think it would be important to find out whether women have experienced this type of problem to better target intervention. So there's just stigma attached to violence against women and violence in cults. So I think we should work on prevention and raising awareness. So yes, that's the end. If you have any question, feel free to ask them. Thank you very much for your attention.